Good evening, everyone. I'm Maggie Howell from the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, The Decolonization of Conservation is Deeper Than You Think. With us tonight is Jazmin, or Sunny is what we'll call her, Murphy, who'll discuss the decolonization of conservation, the parallels of the Eurocentric ideological perspectives towards indigenous people and native carnivores such as wolves and coyotes. And she'll also provide tips to help us dismantle the imbalance of power in the U.S. conservation. A little bit about Sunny. Sunny is a science communicator and reporter specializing in the intersection between North American canid ecology and Black and Indigenous history in the U.S. Through web content writing and journalism, Sunny works to put quality information in the hands of the people, helping the public to understand the historical and scientific context of present-day issues. Sunny earned a bachelor's in science in zoology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is pursuing a master's of science in environmental policy and management through the American Public University System. Her current research focuses on the cognitive and behavioral ecology of coyotes in urban versus rural versus natural landscapes, and how this knowledge can be applied to non-lethal management practices. Sunny has also authored a few books, including Americans Hate Coyotes, How the War on America's Song Dog Began and Why It Persists. So before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during Sunny's presentation, please do not use the chat feature, but rather type them into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll address them at the end of tonight's presentation. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available within a day or two on the Wolf Conservation Center website. So I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to hand the time over to you, Sunny.
All right. Hey, everybody. Wow. Thank you so much for coming and for being a part of this conversation tonight. I'm gonna tell you straight up, this is a hard conversation. This is tough. There's a lot involved, and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of harsh realities that we have to face in order to make progress. And that's what we're here to do today. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the presentation. All right. Okay. All right, so thank you for that introduction. Thank you for hosting this talk tonight. I first want to acknowledge what an honor it is to be speaking with you all on this topic shortly before Juneteenth. I believe it's the 157th Juneteenth coming up on June 19th. That is an annual celebration of the freedom from slavery, particularly a celebration of the time that among the last slaves who were in Galveston, Texas, were told of their freedom 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed. I am so deeply touched that I can honor that history today through this talk, and not only honor that history, but honor the connection of my ancestors' history with the history of Native peoples in this country, as my ancestors, as they escaped the bondage of slavery, would often run to Native nations for safety and protection. So I thank you for this opportunity to honor that history. So today, we're gonna be talking about a lot of things. I wanna invite you into really a new level of thinking. I think that in the United States, we have been really trained to ignore and deny our history, our full history. And I believe that doing so really hamstrings our efforts in conservation and in many things. A crucial aspect of navigating anything, whether it is a physical landscape, whether it is a conceptual landscape, you have to ask yourself, where did we begin? Where did we come from? That question helps you to figure out where you are and where you can go. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about what does it mean that conservation is even colonized? We're going to talk about why it matters that we decolonize conservation. And then we're going to get into two different facets of stakeholder exclusion. I'm going to explain what stakeholder means. First, we're going to talk about Indigenous exclusion in U.S. wildlife management. Then we're going to move into how Black Americans have been excluded in that very thing. Then we're going to go back and reflect on why it matters that we decolonize conservation with our newfound knowledge. And then we're going to go through 5 steps on how we can apply that knowledge to dismantle the power imbalance. All right, so let's start with, what does it mean that conservation is colonized? I argue that this means many different things to many different people. Dr. Madhusudan Kati, who is the co-author of the publication Decoloniality and Anti-Oppressive Practices for a More Ethical Ecology, this paper discussed the limitations of the Western knowledge systems and steps to overcome those limitations. Dr. Kati said, quote, "I grew up in India and I got my training as an ecologist in India, which is a former colony. And it's taken me a long time to realize how much of the training I received was rooted in the Western colonial science framework. So in that sense, some of this attempt to decolonize is personal. Many names of species and things like that are named after European people, but also the ideas of what conservation is supposed to be, the separation of people from nature, and the national park model that has caused a lot of displacement of people and active harm. And some of that is internalized now. It's no longer just these colonizers from outside telling us what to do. We've internalized it completely. So in that sense, to me, it hits pretty deeply. So for now and throughout the rest of this talk, I invite you to think about the ways in which your own thinking about wildlife management and conservation has been affected by this internalization of colonial pressures. So in order to answer the question why it matters that we decolonize conservation, we have to first identify what a stakeholder is. A stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of an organization's purpose. I argue that many stakeholders have been historically shut out of conservation activities in the United States, and none more violently and thoroughly as Black and Indigenous people. At the most fundamental level, this is an issue of involving all of your stakeholders and recognizing all of them as legitimate. In the 1984 book, Strategic Management, A Stakeholder Approach by R.E. Freeman, the author touches on this idea of stakeholder legitimacy, writing, quote, "Stakeholder connotes legitimacy. And while managers may not think that certain groups are legitimate in the sense that their demands on the firm are inappropriate, they had better give legitimacy to these groups in terms of their ability to affect the direction of the firm." Now, what that basically is saying is, even if you don't agree with the perspectives or particular cultural interests of certain stakeholders or interest groups, you had really better take consideration of those interests and perspectives because they can and most likely will affect the trajectory of your organization. And that is why this says, quote, "Effective governance of natural resources requires that stakeholders feel comfortable and positively engaged in a collaborative effort." That is from the Sciences and Art of Adaptive Management. And this is just a quick setup so we understand the framework of why all of this matters. I promise I'll get to the more interesting stuff in a second. In the Department of the Interior's Adaptive Management Applications Guide, the Adaptive Management Working Book states, quote, "A crucial step in any adaptive management application is to involve the appropriate stakeholders. It is particularly important for the stakeholders to take part in assessing the resource problem and reaching agreement about its scope, objectives, and potential actions, even if differences of opinion about system responses remain. Frequently, decision-making is undertaken without agreement, even among managers, about scope, objectives, and management alternatives. Without this agreement, management strategy is likely to be viewed as a reflection of partisan objective or unnecessary constraints on decision-making. The prospects for failure increase dramatically in such a situation." And as you can see right here, stakeholder involvement, identification, management, that is one of the very first things that you need to do when you're setting up the objectives, the actions, the plans of your organization in the context of wildlife management for our case. Knowing who your stakeholders are and consciously involving them in the shaping of management objectives is critical to the development and the execution of successful wildlife management. So as we see with wolves and coyotes, it is actually incredibly difficult to do outreach with these animals because how polarizing these animals can be. At the same time, many people outright refuse to cooperate with non-lethal management practices and are quick to go the lethal route. And I want to quickly note that even people who have benefited from the non-lethal route, and whether that be experimentally or maybe they just wanted to try it for a moment through a program, when they see the positive advantages of that, many revert back to the lethal route. Why is that? I argue that indicates a deeper cultural habitual issue rather than something that's just quantitative or, oh, they just don't want to get involved. These things cause many efforts to mitigate wildlife conflict and conserve endangered species like the red wolf and the Mexican gray wolf. These cause these things to fail or to stagnate. And this right here is why we truly need to push to decolonize conservation. And right here, this is called a stakeholder map. It was presented with the stakeholder theory that now underlies much of adaptive management work. This was originally developed in the context of commercial business, but it still applies, I think, very well to our discussion here. And we'll be taking this map with us throughout the talk today. For our purposes, we're going to place USDA in the middle, as it's the firm that oversees the animal and plant health inspection services. Wildlife services, excuse me, which was once the predator and rodent control. Before that, it was the Bureau of Biological Survey. Before that, it was the Division of Economic Ornithology and Mammalogy. And before that, it was the Division of Economic Ornithology. And I say all of that because I think it's a bit silly how many name changes this organization has had. It makes them really difficult to track. And sometimes I feel like they do it on purpose. According to the USDA APHIS website, USDA APHIS Wildlife Services is partly responsible for the conservation of threatened and endangered species in the United States. It says, quote, the website, protecting threatened and endangered species, T&E, wildlife and plants from the impacts of disease, invasive species, and predators is one focus of the APHIS Wildlife Services program. Wildlife Services T&E, threatened and endangered, species activities are conducted in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state wildlife management agencies, conservation organizations, private landowners, and others. So that list right there is an example of all of the stakeholders that they considered to be relevant to the organization. So let's jump into this. So where did the exclusion of Indigenous people in American conservation begin? Honestly, this is a gigantic question. It's really hard to say because you can say it was from the moment that the age of exploration began. For our scope today, we're going to focus on how it began the moment British colonists landed in the Americas. And here's why. In the book, American Canopy, Trees, Forests, and the Making of a Nation, Eric Rutko talks about how the English age of exploration was largely driven by the fact that the British had depleted much of their natural resources. They were in search of trees to combat the Spanish Navy. And as Rutko writes, quote, in truth, England was suffering from a severe timber crisis that left the poor literally freezing to death in wintertime for want of firewood. So this in mind, they came with the intention to extract by any means necessary for the good of the British people, not for the people in the Americas. And this, by any means necessary, included the subjugation of the native people and the natural habitats and everything that went along with that. And we can see how this played out as the settlers passed down this hegemonic ideology into their descendants. This permeated the settler culture, especially during the times of manifest destiny. Hunters, trappers, fur traders, they all flooded into the West. They annihilated native species like bison and elk. Clearing these species made way for their livestock, which often directly interfered with natives' way of life and encroached on their land, on their ancestral lands. And you could see all of these skins of just bison and a lot of mesopredators down here in the photo on the bottom of everything that they had taken. Keep in mind that these were the same people that would later lobby the federal government to initiate nationwide campaigns against predators like wolves and coyotes to protect their livestock. Wolves and coyotes began to prey on domestic animals because, as you just saw, their natural prey were completely wiped out and their natural habitats were being completely changed very rapidly. In the publication, License to Kill, Reforming Federal Wildlife Control to Restore Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function, the authors write, quote, after state and private bounties on predators became unreliable around 1900, livestock interests lobbied successfully for direct federal involvement in predator eradication, which began as a collaboration between USDA's Forest Service and Bureau of Biological Survey, that's the agency we're going to be looking at, in the early 1900s, and received direct congressional funding in 1915. Federal control of nuisance rodents soon followed, and by 1939, government and Western livestock interests cooperatively funded the Division of Predatory Animal and Rodent Control under the BBS at $1 million, more than $1 million. And here we see just the average family going out into the West, seeing this culture of entitlement to native lands. This family is going out into the West in search of a homestead. These people up on the top are buying lots in California. So we're going to put these individuals here on the customer side. And again, right here, this is not meant to be diagnostic in any sense or a final say. This is just a demonstration of how we can begin to see how these different groups were stakeholders and how they came to shape the USDA and federal conservation that we know today. So they're going to be on the customer side because they are beneficiaries, direct beneficiaries to the federal government's actions on the lands. And as we begin to look at the federal agencies overseeing conservation and wildlife management here in the United States, I want to focus on this. What does Dr. Kati mean when he says Western colonial science framework? In many cases, this refers to an anthropocentric ideology, which shapes knowledge production and implementation, often influenced by Judeo-Christian beliefs that emphasize human sovereignty and superiority over the natural world. I'm going to read a part of this highlighted section here. It says, animal damage control has always been an essential element in the protection of human interests. No country, including this one, could have progressed from a primitive stage without such practices, and control has been employed in the United States since the first European settlers arrived. Indian history records some similar activities. And real quick, I want to note, even though this is Wagner's lecture, this was like some sort of additional document at the end of this. So I don't want to put that on Wagner because I don't believe that he said that in the lecture. So from this excerpt that we just read, we already begin to see a problem. For one, there is a clear devaluation and belittling of Indigenous knowledge and natural resource management practices, and the mention of essentially elevating the North American landscape from its primitive stage through the outright abuse and destruction of the land as it naturally existed before European settlement. According to the speaker, Indian history reflects manipulation of the natural environment to an extent, but not to the supposed effectiveness of those methods which were implemented upon European settlement. And we can see echoes of these sentiments still existing in the current USDA APHIS Wildlife Services directives. This organization, which has been single-handedly responsible for the killing of millions of coyotes and wolves over the years, historically through contracts with violently prejudiced hunters and trappers, and still persisting in those contractual relationships today, it retains echoes of that European hegemony within this very framework. Notice that this also takes on a very instrumental view of natural resources and wildlife, meaning it's looking at wildlife and natural resources in a sense of, how is this profitable? How can this benefit me? Versus how can we protect these things because they are living and valuable in and of themselves? And quickly, I want to read just this middle highlighted section that says, wildlife is a highly dynamic and mobile resource that can cause damage to agriculture and property. pose risks to human health and safety, and affect natural resources. So already we're seeing, again, this prioritization of one type of wildlife or natural resources over another, saying that wildlife can affect natural resources as if they are not a part of that natural resource environment themselves. So separating different parts of the natural world for our own benefit. So let's start going deeper into this. The Western colonial science framework, at least in the scope of wildlife management, was far-reaching. A similar ideology, one that was a bit more explicit in who it did and didn't favor, governed the Bureau of Biological Survey, which, if you remember, again, was the organization that preceded the modern day USDA APHIS. And here, there's just some clips of many in the book Directory of Field Activities from 1939, showing really all of the areas where the Bureau of Biological Survey had reach and had influence over the predator ecology. And as you can see, they would train hunters and trappers to carry out this work. And it was all over the United States. All of the squares are the predator control. And they had an extremely broad reach, cooperated with hunters and trappers all over what is now the United States. Now, this is where we start to pivot a little bit. Unfortunately, those hunters and trappers held violently anti-Native beliefs. So let's read this excerpt from Wolf and Coyote Trapping by A.R. Harding, 1909. He says, quote, "The coyote bears the same relation to the wolf family that the Apache Indian does to the human race. It is a belief among some of the Apaches that they turn into coyotes when they depart this life, and nothing will induce one of them to kill a coyote. Like the Indian, he is sneaky and treacherous and full of the devil." Yeah. Next one. Another book from another very popular hunter. This individual was considered by himself and by many, many hunters and trappers to be the best wolf hunter in the country at the time. This is Ben Corbin, and this is from Corbin's Advice or the Wolf Hunter's Guide. He says, quote, "If Jesus did not disdain to call himself the Good Shepherd, why should any man in Dakota not be proud to be called by that name, or to be associated, as I am, with the men who are feeding their flocks on the rich and abundant pastures on this great commonwealth? Largely, my life has been spent in protecting these flocks against the incursions of ravenous beasts of prey. I know it is but a step, and the first step, which counts in the march of civilization. God made the country, but man made the town. And some of these towns are pretty tough, like most of men's work. I cannot believe that Providence intended that these rich lands, broad, well-watered, fertile, and waving, with abundant pasturage, close by mountains and valleys, filled with gold and every metal and mineral, should be forever monopolized by wild beasts and savage men." Let's keep going. He further says, "The wolf is the enemy of civilization, and I want to exterminate him. If he eats up the flocks, where are your wool and mutton to come from? And what's the use of a tariff on wool and free trade in wolves? I would place the duty higher on both." We've got one more from Ben Corbin. "My father hunted redskins with Daniel Boone and counted the notches on his gun barrel, a notch for every scalp, 14 in all." So now you say, okay, Sunny, I get it, but these are only two hunters, right? Well, no, these guys were really well respected. A lot of people, like I said earlier, considered Ben Corbin to be one of the best, if not the best, wolf hunters in the United States. On top of that, both of these books had really wide reach. They were advertised in Hunter Trader Trapper magazine, which was a popular periodical where many hunters and trappers learned how to go after wolves and coyotes, along with in-person instruction from sessions with the Bureau of Biological Survey. And we're going to look at some documents from that agency right in a second. So it's fair to say that these were widely shared sentiments throughout the culture of hunters and trappers, many of whom were contracted with the federal government and state governments for federal control. And even if maybe not widely shared, they widely tolerated. It's however you want to put it. They felt comfortable and confident enough, and I identified well enough with these ideologies that they published them and shared them among members in their community. And I want to quickly know before we move on, specifically how Corbin said earlier, how he identified as a protector of domestic livestock, a protector of the lands that the settlers and their descendants claim. He could not bear the thought that these lands would be in the hands of savages. Think about that as we continue to go through here, because this is not a simple issue of opinion, perspective. This is an issue of an identity and an ideology that has been formed over generations. Now we look at the Bureau of Biological Survey. You can see that these tensions between white settlers, their descendants, and natives were not reserved to the contracted hunters and trappers. In these documents from 1937 to 1940, we see that Agent Frank S. Glacier, tasked with overseeing operations in Alaska, repeatedly expressed frustration with the natives' unwillingness to cooperate with the BBS approach to hunting and trapping wolves and coyotes. So Frank S. Glacier says, "I have talked with 2 of the natives that own the deer in this herd, and they don't know where the deer are and don't care. They say, what is the use of looking for them? The wolves will have them in a few years. They show no interest in learning to trap or snare wolves, saying it is no use to try to catch the wolves as they are too smart. I think from what reports I have been hearing that that once I can locate this herd, that it will be possible for me to destroy some of these wolves. Think if I can snare or trap some of them, the natives will show some interest. It has been hard so far for me to get any cooperation from the natives. When I speak of hiring a dog team to have an outfit hauled out to where the deer herds are, they tell me that other government officials pay them up to $20 a day for driver and team hire. When I explain to them that they should be willing to help me, as in time the deer will belong to them, they say no. They are government deer, and what is the use? The wolves will soon get them." We're gonna see a little bit more from here. These are really hard to see, so I'm gonna just keep reading them for you, but I'm just gonna read parts of these highlighted sections here. So he says, "So far I have found the natives show very little interest in trapping wolves when it is explained to them that to make a success in trapping wolves, one must work hard." Down here in the second one, "Natives do not seem to know how to use steel traps. This cannot be due to lack of wolf traps. The unit manager in charge of the herds in the Norton Sound district stated to me that he had 10 dozen wolf traps sorted at Igavik. The traps are to be used in connection with the reindeer industry. Whenever I go, the natives tell me of huge bands of wolves, but for some reason or other, they do not seem to be able to destroy many." And the last one, "I have tried to explain to the natives the value of this deer herd in meat and skins for clothing," as if they didn't know that already. "Their answer is that they own only a few deer and that the main part of the herd belongs to the government. Several Eskimos have asked me if I ever saw any crazy wolves. These wolves, so they say, have been known to come into the villages and attack people. How can one handle people with such childish thoughts?" These documents from an agent of the Bureau of Biological Survey, under the Fish and Wildlife Service, as it says right there. These documents give us a peek into the social and ideological dynamics at the time. Not only had Native nations across the continent been violently, very violently, run out of their homelands in the preceding century, and actually it was still going on at this point. But now here the settlers' descendants were trying to tell them how to manage the animals that they had lived alongside for thousands of years, trying to impose on them that this is the way that it should be done. So quickly, I'm going to show you a short clip to help demonstrate how contracted hunters and fur trappers were vital to the Bureau of Biological Survey and later iterations of this organization for predator control. And this video was obtained through the US National Archives. Oh darn, I hope that goes away. Okay, good. An area set aside for the preservation of game and animals under natural conditions, intelligent effort must be made to balance the number of animals with the amount of forage produced on the range so that the largest number may be maintained indefinitely for the enjoyment of visitors. See a little bit of that anthropocentrism. This is game management. You can see the full clip on National Archives. With both range and herd in deplorable condition, it is necessary to reduce and hold the numbers of deer to the carrying capacity of the range. Regulated hunting by sportsmen is the chief means of removing surplus animals. Hunting is permitted only on designated overstocked areas. And they're showing the area that they are managing, the different areas that they're managing. Here, hunting camps are established in cooperation with the State Game Department of Arizona. A deputy game warden and a forest ranger are in charge at each camp. So this is where you start to see how the system kind of works when hunters and trappers come in. So they arrive at the site right here. And it'll tell you shortly that they begin to get their instruction, they receive their licenses, they're taken care of, and then they go out and they do their thing. Here they obtain license, permits, and a camp assignment and receive instructions. Coming out with their licenses. Water is supplied to the dry camps by daily trips of a water truck. Sometimes they hired guides. And don't worry, you're not missing any sound. This is a silent film. Pretty old. I wish I remembered the year. It's just a bunch of buzzing. Control of predatory animals is essential to proper game management. Numbers of mountain lion are controlled via sportsman hunting. I think that says by sportsman hunting. So again, we see that prioritization of which wildlife are worth conserving versus others and which need to be lethally controlled. And in many documents from this age, I think in the Bureau of Biological Survey and probably up to predator and rodent control, I believe the language used is desirable wildlife, desirable game. So you have this prioritization of which species are desirable and which are not. And here you see what Glacier was actually talking about in the documents we just read, how he was expressing frustration with the natives not wanting to cover traps with dirt. And this was actually part of the training, because by this time, coyotes and wolves had started to catch on to the methods that the settlers and their descendants were using to trap these animals. No wonder that the natives didn't want to use those methods. They weren't working. Obviously, there were many, many reasons beyond that too. All right. All right, so now we are here. If my slides want to catch up to me, please. All right, so now we're here. I'm putting the hunters and the trappers down here at trade associations and employees, and this is because on the one hand, the fur trappers and the hunters were obviously, they were a part of the fur industry, which was really booming at this time, in which the federal government failed multiple times to try to control. And I'm going to put them by employees too, because they were contracted with the federal government to continue. So we're starting to build this picture of what the stakeholder map looks like. These, I don't have exactly the time to go over, but I just couldn't, my heart couldn't take it to remove these from the presentation. So what I'm doing here is I want you to take screenshots, or later, if anybody is watching this recorded, please go and pause this here. These are talking about really the coyotes and the wolves' place in many indigenous peoples' belief systems and knowledge systems, the place that these animals really kept. They are and were extremely important spiritual figures within these nations. And I want to bring that up because that introduces a completely different facet of this talk. It's not just about the hunting, the recreation, the belief that, oh, I'm this protector of domestic livestock. This is a complete upending of Native belief systems. They have to mischaracterize the coyote, for example, as only the trickster, when it was never just the trickster. You have to mischaracterize these animals in order to give license to yourself to launch these deadly campaigns against them. So yeah, please go ahead and take screenshots of these or pause the video later on and just read through what these animals mean to these nations and understand really how multifaceted this effort to exterminate wolves and coyotes is. All of this that we just talked about is exactly how we get situations like this. This report detailed the experience of Robert Gosnell, who's nicknamed Goose, who had previously worked as the state director for USDA APHIS in New Mexico. Gosnell began to notice that reports citing wolf kills as justification for the removal of endangered Mexican gray wolves were unfounded. When he blew the whistle and attempted to reform the organization, he was met with severe retaliation. He lost his job and he was transferred out of New Mexico. Note that when livestock owners cite wolf depredation as the reason for their livestock losses, they're entitled to compensation for the Fish and Wildlife from the Fish and Wildlife Service and related programs. This type of corruption is not new. In a lecture on predator control in the US titled Coyotes and Sheep, Frederick H. Wagner stated, quote, "The industry has obviously accepted on faith the assumptions that the benefits equaled the cost. But Dorward L. Allen, former chief of wildlife research for the Fish and Wildlife Service, has told me that he repeatedly requested funds during the 1950s for evaluation of federal predator control, and his requests never received serious consideration, presumably because research would arouse the concern of Predator and Rodent Control Division. In more recent years, since the reorganized Division of Wildlife Services has been under the able and objective administration of Jack H. Berryman, research funds to evaluate the program has still been wholly inadequate, and the industry remains convinced that it is getting value received from its expenditure," end quote. Even A.R. Harding, author of Wolf and Coyote Trapping, one of the excerpts that we just looked at, he openly discussed how federal control wasn't working. He said, quote, "If bounties resulted in the extermination of the wolves or in an important reduction in their number, the bounty system should be encouraged. But if it merely begets fraud and yields a perpetual harvest for the support of a floating class of citizens, other means should be adopted," end quote. Remember, that was in 1909. We are still struggling with a system that refuses, not just refuses to change, refuses to even be reviewed, refuses to even consider the possibility that there might be a need for change. And when you think about that, now look at it through this new lens of realizing, oh, this actually began from a mindset that started here of we need to extract for an empire. We need to extract by any means necessary, passing on that ideology to their descendants who believe themselves to be the protectors of these lands that were claimed by settlers that did not actually belong to them. These people who believed that these animals and Native people were essentially the bane of their species' existence. Think about all of those things, these ideologies, these identities. And now it starts to get a little bit clearer, doesn't it, of why there is so much resistance to change in the system and why wolves and coyotes are targeted so heavily. And I want to note really quick, this isn't an argument that, oh, everybody in the federal government is racist and like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that these are ideologies that still exist, have permeated for generations, and still underlie the systems and have directly shaped the systems which oversee, control federal, wildlife management and wildlife conservation in this country. Whether people recognize that they follow these ideologies or not, some people do so outright. Some people are proud to follow these ideologies, but they are still there. Now, I want to close out this segment by saying, by talking about this conversation that I had with Eagle Feather Woman of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. She is a leading fighter against the Keystone XL pipeline and a protector of her ancestral lands of the sacred Black Hills and much more. She told me about her experiences and how she and other native land defenders still face blatant racism in their efforts to protect natural landscapes. She says, quote, "We've really had to fight to even have a seat at the table. We still deal with racism, institutional racism. That's kind of always the elephant in the room. When we all meet, we have to understand that that's there and that there's going to be things on both sides that are going to trigger one another. There is still a very big divide between Indigenous communities and the non-Native communities in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska." Really quick, remember Ben Corbin in his excerpt talked about being a Dakota man. That ideology is still there. These 3 states, including anywhere up here where we call the far north, has a huge racism problem. So I am putting, again, this is not diagnostic, it's just to demonstrate where these groups potentially lie on the stakeholder map. So I'm going to put Indigenous nations next to government and political groups. They could go in many different places around here, but I'm putting them there because immediately after the quote that I just shared with you from Eagle Feather Woman, she talked about how there are over 700 treaties between the United States and Indigenous nations across the continent. How many have been actually respected? That's another story for another day. However, these nations are government bodies. They are people groups. They are groups with political interests, groups with cultural beliefs, groups that have directly lived alongside these wolves and coyotes, that know how to manage them. And these animals have significant spiritual meaning to them. However, they are being told, we don't want you here. Your beliefs don't matter in the way that we manage these species, and you are not welcome as a stakeholder, either because we believe you are savage, we don't care about your knowledge systems, or we don't care about what these animals mean to you. You are now shut out of being a stakeholder. So now we're going to move into this next section here. This facet concerns a little bit more of the broadness of colonization and really urges you to understand the Western colonial science framework as it relates to another group whose history we don't like to tell, and that is my people. This says, quote, "The old fur traders always got a Negro, if possible, to negotiate for them with the Indians because of their pacifying effect. They could manage them better than the white men with less friction." And this was actually a historical trend. Now, why is this important? Because not only were trappers a part of the system that were managing wolves and coyotes and desirable game, but they were also stakeholders in the system, whether they were contracted or not. Thus, their perspectives and their activities were and are crucial to effective wildlife management. And Black people were central to this. As you can see in this image in the background, the enslaved African people were important for settlers' ability to navigate what is now the United States. They often kept their enslavers alive. In this case, we're looking at York. He was the enslaved African man who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition across North America. Without him, they likely would not have made it at all or very far. settler reliance on slave labor in this capacity carried on into the fur trade, as we see with this quote, and that directly contributed to coyote and wolf hunting and trapping. And let's quickly look at some of these fur traders. In the book, Black People Who Made the Old West, William Loren Cantz writes, by the 1850s, the fur trade became a major American industry. Histories of the fur trade have usually pictured an occupation dominated by French and Scots-Irish immigrants, and indeed they played a leading part in its growth. However, Blacks also played a hitherto unheralded part since the early days of the new nation. They were among the entrepreneurs, voyagers, and hunters. One of them, who we're looking at now, is James Beckworth. James Beckworth, he likely grew up as a slave in Virginia, and he later joined the Rocky Mountain Fur Company under Colonel William Ashley. He soon mastered many different weapons and was even brought into a tribe in the Crow Nation, as one woman believed he was her long-lost son. He was given the name Morning Star, but he was very quick to temper, so he was later renamed Bloody Arm. He led many battles with the Crow Nation against the Blackfeet, and he even fought in the Seminole War in Florida. Another one, George Bonga. Cantz writes, quote, George Bonga was a local legend among both red and white men. His frontier skills, command of languages, and ability as a diplomat assured him of friends wherever he went. George was the son, that was end quote. George was the son of an enslaved person named Pierre and a member of the Chippewa Nation. As an adult, he knew how to speak English, French, and Chippewa. It is believed that his family was able to buy their freedom by his adulthood, and Governor Lewis Cass hired George as an interpreter, which was later crucial to the negotiation of the Chippewa Treaty of 1837. He worked as a voyager for the American Fur Company at posts in Lac Platz, Otter Tail Lake, and Leech Lake. His descendants gave rise to the Bongo Township in Cass County, Minnesota. These are just two of the ancestors of African Americans, Black Americans, who are stakeholders in this the fur trade, but also in the management of predatory species. So we're going to move further into the future now. We're going to talk about how these stakeholders were more intentionally left out of conservation, even though it was their heritage that they were highly influential stakeholders and had been for centuries. Black Americans suffered relatively little access to natural spaces. Most parks facilities were reserved for use by white Americans, and many of those available to Black citizens were too far to reach without a car. This required Black people who wished to visit state parks to take public transportation, forcing them to endure violent racism on their travels. Negro parks were often in disrepair. So really quick, the image that we're looking at here on the top, it's looking at the parks system and park lands available for white people. The little dots that you see in the circles are representative of parks that are already in existence and need to be improved. And the circle is the radius of people who are being served by this park. Now you can see how many are just overlapping there. And then let's look at the bottom here, where you can hardly see any of those little dots, and you can only see the big dots where recommended land acquisition is, and how few communities are actually being served by these systems. Let me give you a couple of numbers here. Between the 1930s and 60s, only about 40 sites were accessible to Black Americans. And half of these were dual use, meaning white people could use them during specific periods when Black people were not allowed on the premises. And you did hear me say the 60s, many parks were not desegregated until the 60s. State parks specifically for Black people totaled 18 in 1940, while those for whites totaled 180. Further, 986,184 acres of parkland across 9 states were available for white people, while only 8,879 acres were available to Black Americans. For white people, this was all a part of the growing effort at the time to distance themselves from non-white people who started to grow in population in cities as immigrants started to move in. Historian Stephen R. Fox summarized the fears of white wealthy supporters of the growing wilderness movement, saying, quote, wilderness provided a safety valve for nativist worries over the new immigrants and their high birth rates. Immersed in the wilderness, the gentry hoped to recover the lost manly virtues, courage, self-reliance, physical strength, and dexterity, and so to avoid the specter of race suicide. In other words, losing the Anglo-Saxon race, losing the English-speaking race, losing the white race to all of these immigrants that were coming in. To make matters worse, Black families could also not afford cars, which means that they couldn't get to these parks, which means they had to rely on public transportation. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about what this was like. He says, quote, "Did you ever see a Jim Crow waiting room? There are always exceptions, but usually there is no heat in winter and no air in summer. With undisturbed loafers and trained hands and broken, disreputable settees, to buy a ticket is torture. You stand and wait until every white person at the other window is waited on. The agent browbeats and contradicts you, hurries and confuses the ignorant, gives many persons the wrong change, compels some to purchase their tickets on the train at a higher price, and sends you and me out on the platform burning with indignation and hatred." It was terrible to go and try to visit these natural spaces and engage with wildlife and engage in the heritage of hunting and connecting to the natural landscape. It was terrible to do that because of how hard it was for Black people to get out there. William O'Brien writes, quote, "Many potential travelers, however, would opt to forego a possibly humiliating and even dangerous trip simply develop safer recreation activities nearer to home." So what did the white people do with this? They said, oh, I guess Black people just don't care about the environment. And that is where we now have that stereotype. Black people don't go outside. Black people don't care about the environment. Black people don't care about wildlife. That's exactly where that comes from. And that is a part of why so many Black people are often left out of this conversation and excluded from being a legitimate stakeholder in this conversation because they are just assumed to not care. Uncomfortable, humiliating, or simply inconvenient treatment and experiences were not the only thing that Black people had to deal with at the time. Segregation and racial customs were enforced extremely severely. This says, quote, "Most Southern white Americans who grew up prior to 1954, my grandma was born in 1944, expected Black Americans to conduct themselves according to well-understood rituals of behavior. This racial etiquette governed the actions, manners, attitudes, and words of all Black people when in the presence of whites. To violate this racial etiquette placed one's very life and the lives of one's family at risk." That risk was lynching. Lynching was an extreme, violent, and common practice across the entire United States, well into the 50s, according to what's on record. It was used as a weapon to reinforce the barriers erected to keep Black and white people separate. And you can see right here just how expansive and how broad this reached. It's difficult to imagine now what lynching might have been like. You know, you hear the term and you're like, okay, I know that was bad. I know it's bad. But I don't think we really know how bad it was. White people would steal Black people from their homes. They would stalk them as they drove or walked down the streets. They dragged them behind vehicles. They shot their bodies dozens of times, all before hanging their bodies up on trees or other tall structures. Sometimes many were burned alive. In many cases, this was seen as a community activity. People would bring their families to witness this, and many would take home body parts as souvenirs. And if we want to make any progress, we need to face this very uncomfortable reality. It is harsh, it is scary, but it is real, and it is US history. And it is part of what has excluded Black Americans as stakeholders, not only in conservation, but in everything across the United States. This was the threat. This was the threat. If you did not like the facilities available to you When you tried to go out and enjoy wildlife and enjoy hunting and enjoy recreation, you didn't like your facility, you didn't like how much space that you had, you couldn't just go to another space and say, oh, I'm gonna go fishing over there. You couldn't do that. Sometimes you couldn't even go out to the Negro areas, because if you were alone, this could be your fate. And we wonder why so many Black people, not all, but so many Black people do not feel safe in the outdoors. So we're going to take a moment. I want us to just pause for a second. The last time that I did a different version of this talk, somebody told me that they were kind of bawling their eyes out after seeing that, because they didn't know how bad lynching really was. So just take a moment, let's breathe and collect ourselves. And I want you to ask yourself, how can a people who has been shut out in such a violent way feel welcome to participate in the conservation of natural resources, in the conservation of the very natural landscapes where they were murdered? Would you feel welcome? Would you feel welcome? So these are a couple of newspaper clips that I have here. Again, this is another thing that I don't necessarily have time to go through, but I want you to take a screenshot here. I know that this is kind of blurry. I'm sorry, I wish it could be better. I'm going to quickly note this right here, that lynching wasn't the only threat. In this newspaper clipping here, we see that, let me just go ahead and read this to you. Over in Georgia, a wealthy planter is on trial charged with murder. Like a great many farmers who operate on a large scale, this farmer was accustomed to take Negroes charged with crime out of jail and work them pending trial. And it is charged that, like many farmers in other sections, he found one excuse and then another to keep the Negroes on the farm and from attending court and standing trial. Black people could literally be forced back into slavery if they went to jail for violating Black codes, Jim Crow laws, or just happening across the wrong white person and being accused of a crime. I'm going to quickly play a clip for you to demonstrate, really fight against this idea. We think, oh, well, desegregation was passed, everything was fine, right? No, people fought it, and they fought it very hard.
To most Negroes, the most important progress has been in the field of education. This is Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957, when Negro students encountered violence in their attempt to register at a previously all-white school. Traditionally in the South, schools had been segregated. So it is not surprising that there was opposition when the Supreme Court ordered schools to integrate. But violence could not be tolerated. President Eisenhower ordered in federal troops to support the rights of the Negro students. To the eyes of the world, the fact of violence tended to obscure the true meaning of Little Rock. Its importance was that it demonstrated to those who opposed integration that they would ultimately have to give way. Negroes' rights would be upheld by the federal government.
We're going to play one more. This is Presidential Advisor Lee White talking to President Lyndon B. Johnson about desegregating areas in the United States.
With governors. So I want to know, number one, is it absolutely essential I do it, or can somebody else do it equally as well? That's number one. All right. Before I do it, shouldn't I check with Russell Long and Senator Ellender and get a local feel of it? Hail bogs a little bit where I can feel it a little better before I talk to the governor. What are we going to do if the governor says no? I would guess he would say no. He's not going to try to enforce our Supreme Court decision, is he?
Well, except that he's got the problem of being the only governor. What I've compiled is a whole list of states in which every other governor has been willing to take the law and order position without regard to whether they approved of an order. The last time that federal troops have had been used is in Oxford, Mississippi. Since that time, Clemson has been desegregated. Macon County, Alabama, which is just as tough a county as St. Helena Parish. Governor Bryant was willing to do that in St. Augustine. Governor Wallace brought in National Guard troops. Jimmy just desegregated Baton Rouge without any federal troops being there, and I think we got a pretty good case. I don't suppose he wants federal troops any more than you do.
Federal troops. Federal troops. That's how extreme the resistance to desegregation was. So I'm just going to put, just within the scope of the fur traders and the people who are intermediaries between the settlers and the indigenous peoples, I'm just going to put them on suppliers. Again, this is a demonstration. They could go in so many different places, especially since this covers so many different things with how Black people have been excluded from the conversation as stakeholders. And on that point, they have been told no through Jim Crow, no through geographic location of parks, no through socioeconomic disparities, even though you were central to our ability to navigate these natural landscapes and engage with the Native people and do our job to control predators, you are no longer a stakeholder. You are not a part of this conversation. So now we're going to return to this question: why does it matter that we decolonize conservation? How do you ensure your stakeholders feel comfortable if you, A, you don't know what's making them uncomfortable in the first place? B, you refuse to acknowledge what's making them uncomfortable? C, you neglect to create an environment which would offer comfort in light of their discomforts? Further, how can you invite stakeholders to participate if you do not consciously seek or desire their engagement in collaborative efforts? And I asked that final question in reference to everything that we just saw, these very intentional, multifaceted efforts to upend Native culture, belief systems, and management practices, to upend Black people's ability to connect with the natural landscape. How can you make sure that they feel comfortable if you are doing all of those things? And we're going to close now with these 5 steps to dismantle this system. 1, we need to teach the cultural and socioeconomic pressures excluding Black and Indigenous people from Western conservation leadership. We need to demand educational programs covering authentic US history in schools. And I say that specifically in response to this ability to opt out of Black History Month, the whitewashing of Native history. It needs to stop. 2, we need an open and honest review of the extent to which white supremacist influence rooted in historical racial dynamics in America has shaped the US STEM education, national parks, and wildlife management system, including fields like ecology and conservation and current wildlife management practices, especially in Native ancestral lands. 3, we need to address historic exclusionary hiring, recruitment processes in STEM institutions. This includes the physical locations of universities, histories of those universities, and socioeconomic barriers. Are you shutting people out because you glorify a Confederate leader? Are you shutting people out because you are setting these exorbitantly high prices for your tuition? Are you shutting people out because you are intentionally locating your universities in places where they cannot geographically reach them? 4, reach out to more diverse communities in your wildlife management programs. Confront the reality that the barrier to greater Black and Indigenous representation in US conservation is not these communities' lack of concern for their environments. It is the historical precedent that has made participating in these activities dangerous and contradictory to cultural identity. Dr. Sweeney Winchief talks about how Alaskan Native and American Indian students are forced to ignore and neglect their cultural identity in order to fit within the Western science framework. Step 5 and last one, embrace multiple ways of knowing. Westerners hyperfixate on studies that assign quantitative values. This is not the only way of gathering and distributing useful information. We need to respect oral history and traditions. And finally, I would like to share a quote from Dr. Jess Orbach, another co-author of the paper, Decoloniality and Anti-Oppressive Practices that I referenced earlier. She says, in order to shift power dynamics, somebody has to give up power. For the space to become more inclusive, there also has to be less power in the hands of whiteness. And perhaps it's unsurprising that there's going to be some resistance to that. So I want to thank you all for coming to this talk today. I want to thank the Wolf Conservation Center for being brave enough and forward-minded enough to have this conversation and to invite your members in to talk about this. Again, I'm so honored and thank you.
Oh my goodness, Sunny. I don't think I've seen so many positive and appreciative comments in the chat. I think you can see them popping up from your view too. So it's a little distracting, but look at them go right now. So, and I think everyone's just really, really impressed with just the way you told this story, your passion, and made it digestible in a way that it's just a little nibble. But
well, yeah, this was only scratching the surface. There was so much I wanted to include in here, but we would be here all day.
But you did a really, really great job presenting this.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. So before we get to questions, just what for those of you who joined after the introduction, we are here with Sunny Murphy, who just finished her presentation about the decolonization of conservation. And if you do have questions, don't put them in that chat. If you stick them in the Q&A, that's how we'll find them. And I
see people saying that the action steps went by kind of fast. Is it okay if I just put them on screen?
Of course, yes. And actually, there have been some questions that I've seen in the chat and also in the Q&A. Yes, we will. This is being recorded, and excuse me. And it will be on the Wolf Conservation Center's website and YouTube channel just as soon as we get it up there. So just a day or two. So you can watch it at your own pace and do screenshots and whatever you need to do. Yeah. I have a feeling I will be doing that. So let me get to one of the earlier questions. This question is described as a doozy. But our natural history and conservation is often condensed and celebrated under the framework of the North American model of conservation. And this model is cherished by sports persons, groups, and also presented as an infallible model, the best in the world. So as we attempt to decolonize the conservation space, what can we do to address this model, which actively supports the current model of funding conservation through fishing and hunting? So how do we change that paradigm?
Ooh,
it is a doozy.
That's hard. Particularly that last part and the funding of it. I actually quickly, with that question, I want to refer to, so I grew up in a town called Beaumont. It's a rural town in Southern California. When I was there, it was a small town, and there was a few individuals that I met there. One of them that I'm remembering in particular, who I had a conversation with, who was a hunter. And there is this ideology among many hunters that we are the true conservationists because, you know, we're the ones that go out there. We're the one who spend time out in the bush, and we fund the conservation, all that kind of stuff. And I think there needs to be a real review of that. And this is not anything against, I don't see anything wrong with hunting. I'm going to go to the next action steps just so you can see the other ones. However, I do think it is dangerous for that to be, for conservation to be so dependent on that, because as we've just seen, there is a certain ideology among some hunters that really promotes this Eurocentric, Judeo-Christian human superiority idea and this entitlement to other organisms' lives just because they are non-human. I think honestly, just kind of how, as I said here, I think that there must be a review of how these things are structured and why they're structured that way. And as we saw, there is some extreme resistance to that. But unless we want to stay in the same place that we are, unless we want to see the red wolf disappear, the Mexican gray wolf disappear, then we need to really step back and demand of our institutions, hey, like, how are you funding this? Who are the people that you have in charge here? And during public comment periods, those are really important. And through organizations like this, like the Wolf Conservation Center, talk to your representatives and say, like, we really need to do a review of how this system is not only structured, but how it's funded, because I see that contributing to the ideological damage. I see that contributing to the stakeholder exclusion. That is not an easy question at all. It is something that requires, honestly, I think generations of resistance to this system, and not even just coming at it like that, but identifying yourself and saying, hey, I am a stakeholder. I matter in this conversation because I like to go outside. I like to enjoy wildlife. I go on hikes, I go camping, I go fishing, I do all of these things. Or it is my heritage that, my ancestors hunted, my ancestors fished here, my ancestors contributed to the system that is allowing you and employing you right now, allowing you to do these things. So my perspective matters as a stakeholder, and you need to listen to how we the people are saying this needs to be fixed, this needs to be reviewed, and this needs to be restructured. And that starts, I think, on a very, that can start from the bottom, that can start from the top, but the place that's most resistant to this change, I think, as we just saw, is that federal government, particularly in the USDA and the Fish and Wildlife Services. And that resistance needs to be addressed before we even start to talk about change. Yeah, that's really hard.
You did a pretty good job. And there have been some comments, and what we're definitely familiar with it as well. There is a campaign right now that is called Wildlife for All, and I believe the website is wildlifeforall.us. If anyone wants to check that out, that really is dedicated to really reforming state wildlife management to be more scientific and open, and not driven just by really this hook and bullet model. Okay. Here's something. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, in response to a comment I just saw, I don't think the claim is that hunters are the primary funders of conservation. I don't think that's the claim. And if I said that, I apologize, and that's not what I meant. Hunters are a large part of conservation funding. That is what the statement is.
Okay. Here's the question. I am a white person working in wildlife conservation for the Anishinaabe Band, and I'm so grateful and refreshed to hear this talk. How did you get started on this journey of studying this colonial history toward Indigenous and Black folks?
Really, it was kind of, I kind of stumbled into it. When I started my master's program, my second choice actually for a study organism and study project was the coyote. It was actually not my first choice. And as I started to look more into the coyote, and there's a comment that I see right there that I want to respond to, but as I started studying more about the coyote, and I started digging into, like, oh my gosh, like this species, why do people hate this animal so much? Like, what is going on? Why is this so divisive? And I'm from the desert. So coyotes are just like an everyday thing to me. I'm pretty used to it. And I'm also super into a lot of different outdoors activities. So I never had a problem with coyotes, but I started to see how divisive they are. And I started to see the extent to which lethal management is enacted. And that's when I started to dig into, this is super rooted in a lot of, settler ideology, like how the campaign against coyotes and wolves started, why it persists in the way that it does. And so it was really this rabbit hole, and how that kind of translated into this overlap between Black and Indigenous US history. And the reason that I think I said in the beginning too, that I kind of juxtapose these things is because Black and Indigenous people, actually have a very intertwined history here in the United States. Remember the image that I showed you of York. There were many slaves like that who were crucial to helping settlers navigate the land. And whenever, as I mentioned too, they functioned as intermediaries between these white settlers and between the Native peoples. And when Black people would flee their enslavers, they would often go to a lot of Native settlements in search of that protection and search of that safety. And it's actually documented in many historical documents of the people, white authorities complaining about this, is like, oh, the slaves run off to the settlements. And, so it was a common thing. And Native peoples, even with the enslaved Africans who would journey along with these colonists, the Native peoples recognized that they weren't just companions. They weren't doing this willingly. They were being forced to do this. And so there has been this long-standing compassion, this long-standing understanding between Indigenous peoples and the African diaspora here in the United States. And so that's it really was a rabbit hole that kind of brought me to all of this. I quickly want to respond. There's a comment in here that I saw. Someone says that you lost me at hunting is okay and fishing is okay. Hunting and fishing are essential parts of life. Not everything is trophy hunting. Not everything is sports hunting. Sometimes sustenance hunting is completely okay. And if we're going to be having this conversation about being consciously inclusive about different cultures and about different peoples, then we need to get into this mindset that maybe not everything is as the Western framework has made it. Not everything is about extraction. Not everything is about dominance. Indigenous people have been here for thousands of years and have always hunted for their sustenance. Hunting is a crucial part of life. And so if you're going to be genuinely a part of this conversation, that mindset of, oh, Natives shouldn't be allowed to hunt because hunting is bad, we shouldn't be allowed to hunt, it's bad, and it's against Native. No, that's not, I'm going to say that I don't believe that that is aligned. And I don't believe that that is crucial, or excuse me, what's my word here? That belongs in this conversation in order to effectively decolonize, as we're talking about here, and not in the buzzword sense. We need to talk about how hunting has played a role in different cultures and not just write it off because we're uncomfortable with the fact that there is a network of species that exist among one another. And sometimes that entails hunting. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, the debate is raging on in the chat, but
I think that is an important part of this conversation. If we're going to talk about and think about different cultures, then hunting is going to be a part of that conversation. And you can't just come into this conversation and say hunting is bad, and if you say that, I'm gone. I think that's part of the problem when we talk about welcoming Indigenous cultures.
No, I think you explained that pretty well. All right.
And hunting and poaching are not the same thing.
Sorry. Chat always gets us.
Fine, I'm not worried about it. I really want people to understand that it's not just one thing.
And this is a question and I wasn't aware of this, but someone is asking, maybe you, or maybe if people are planning on using this presentation to the USDA in response to its call for comments due just at the end of this month, so July 1st, regarding its 5-year strategic plan. So it's interesting. I don't know if you've thought about, obviously it's been a lot about USDA as the model. And wildlife services. Be interesting if anyone chose to. So I'm sure it is going to be public on our YouTube, and feel free to use the link if you think it's helpful into really reforming anything there that could benefit really about everybody. Okay, let's see. Sorry, there's a few here, mostly kudos. How can we be effective and what can we do when we're fighting corrupt government agendas? Sunny, you have the answer to this. These are big questions. And lobbyists that have the money and resources to push back against effective change. Well,
yeah,
question probably for all of us.
Yeah. Again, that's hard. And I'll full transparency here. I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I'm not gonna lie. So when I think about this, really what we're up against with the lobbying and the money, it's just the thought of it is like exhausting. But really, I'll go back, I think, to what I said with I think it was action step 1. I think honestly, a lot of this starts at education. It is such a shame that I didn't know a lot of my own history as a Black American until my 2nd to 3rd year of college. A lot of people in this country, as I very briefly mentioned, opt out of our history, whether that be in the form of opting out of Black History Month as they do in schools, whether that be in the form of, quite literally opting out of like engaging in history class, anything like that. I think a lot of people deny the real history of the United States because it is so uncomfortable and because it is so harsh and because it is so dark. The United States has always been a violent place. And I think people are not really ready to acknowledge that. And I think as long as we intentionally do not educate ourselves, we will always be subject and vulnerable to the actions of the federal government. And whatever frameworks they want to impose on us, because we quite literally will not have the tools, we will not have the critical training, the critical thinking training. We will not have the knowledge and the sense of belonging, because with knowing your history comes a sense of belonging. We will not have those things without that education to begin with. And I think that it really starts there. And I think that's why it's so important, to me at least, to tell your communities, to tell your representatives, like, hey, we really need to do a full review of how we teach, not just our children, but are there opportunities for adults to continue learning without having to shell out tens of thousands of dollars just to learn their own country's history? You can go to these US National Archives, you can go to the Library of Congress, and you can look up almost everything that I used, all these materials, the videos, the documents, almost everything that I used in this presentation today was available to the public on the US National Archives or Library of Congress. So in our education systems, even if we don't want to teach those uncomfortable realities, teach people how to use these publicly available resources, teach people that they are there. I think that those are some of the most fundamental steps that we need to take when it comes to starting the fight against these gigantic organizations that can lobby to their heart's content. If you don't have the education to begin with, you don't have the foundation of knowledge to begin with, you just can't go anywhere. And you will likely not make as effective of a change as you desire to. And I think that is really the first and central step to really fighting the status quo.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these questions, some that we're not even going to get to, just going back to those 5 steps, those 5 recommendations, I think really is a starting place. So I definitely, there are some questions here of people asking about, because we mentioned it in your bio, just your current work with coyotes. If you wanted to share a little bit more about that and how the topic today applies.
Yeah. Okay. So I am looking at, so in my book that I wrote, it's a collection of essays, the one that you mentioned earlier, Americans Hate Coyotes. At the end of that, I present this experimental approach, adaptive management approach to coyote management. And in that, there are two halves. There's the coyote side and there's the human side. And so with the coyote side, I really want to look at the behavioral and cognitive ecology of that animal. Look at how, what is their thinking process? What is their behavioral process around us? And when we're not around, and there's already a lot of literature on that, in a sense that, like, they change their schedules depending on, if we're active in the mornings, if we're active in the evenings, they can very well adapt to that. They can adapt to so many different landscapes and habitats. But I'm looking in a sense of their, what's my word here? I'm struggling to come up with the word, habituation. There we go. I'm looking at their habituation and how they have really acclimated to certain communities, how they've gotten used to and adapted their behavior and even their thinking to communities. And that is in the sense of what kinds of, like, are they attracted to certain objects? How well can they solve these puzzles? Because there's actually been a lot of studies into wolves and how they can solve certain puzzles, like multi-step puzzles. And that helps to kind of gauge the intelligence of the species in question. And that is essential to shaping the human side, where it says, considering how the coyote behaves, how can people then adjust their behavior to mitigate conflict between people and coyotes? So, for example, do you leave your pet outside? I know this is pretty controversial right here, but do you leave your pet outside? That's probably a problem. Unsupervised, that's probably an issue because a coyote can come and get it. Do you feed coyotes? Do you allow your pets, and yes, this is a thing, do you allow your pets to play with coyotes? All of those things are things that increase the likelihood of conflict between people and coyotes. So with the knowledge of the coyote's behavioral and cognitive ecology, knowing how that works, we can then piece together the human element and say, okay, people, this is how we need to behave and manage our communities. We need to put our trash away. We need to stop feeding the wildlife. We need to do all these different things. And that way we can mitigate, we can reduce the amount of conflict that's between us, and we can make a better world for both us and coyotes. And so that's the gist of what I'm looking at. And on the human side, that's kind of where I've been digging into this rabbit hole here. Looking at the history, because there are certain communities that are more prone to calling the police on a coyote and having the police shoot it. There are certain communities that are more prone to that than others. So I want to look at, the and as I mentioned earlier, the prevalence of lethal management, even when non-lethal has been shown to be more advantageous. Look at the historical reasons for that. Look at the heritage, the ideology that comes along with that, and what causes it to persist. And then we can begin to develop a more effective management program that really benefits people of many different communities and the coyote itself. So that's kind of like the gist of what I study and like what I'm going for.
Well, I think it's great. And, definitely want to share just the links where people can buy. You have more than one book, don't you?
I do. I do. I wish I'm so bad about this because I didn't have control of the title, and I think it's really long and I can never remember it, but I basically call it Coyote 101, and you could find it that way. It's I'm really bad about this. And I'm also, there's a part of the book that I hate the formatting. Didn't have much control over it. But yeah, it's called Coyote 101. It's about 101 facts about coyotes and how to love them. Yeah, so there's that one, and then there's Americans Hate Coyotes. And I'm actually, with Americans Hate Coyotes, I'm actually working on a new addition to that, because a lot of the research that I've just showed you here, I'm going to be digging deeper into that, and that stuff I actually want to include in the book, because it was just an ensemble of my essays that I did in school. And so I really want to like flesh that out and like make it an actual book now, with like that's more appealing to just the average reader, because it is pretty academic. So yeah, that's my books.
I think that sounds really cool. So let me find one more good question. They're coming in pretty fast.
Yes, there it is. Thank you so much, Greta. How Expert Guide to Coyotes, 101 plus lessons to learn about, embrace, and love coyotes from A to Z. Thank you, Greta. Perfect.
All right. I guess maybe just, it's also a big question. I think people have been talking about it a lot recently, but just if you have any good ways to start these kind of conversations, with people, and there's obviously resistance. I'm sure you've seen a lot of that as well, but do you have any tips on how you can really just get these conversations going where people can be open-minded and actually just listen?
Yeah. Okay, so let me think about how I've done this in the past. Honestly, okay, I'm going to give two different examples here. Some of the ways that I've started conversations, I don't really know. I wish I remembered how exactly they came up. But usually it just comes up that I love coyotes. And typically, honestly, that's weird enough that people will talk to me about it. Because people, like we've talked about, these animals are really polarizing. And so not only is it unusual, and this is just for obviously within my own subjective experience, but not only is it unusual that to too many people, not factually, but too many people, that a Black person would love wildlife, but also that they would love something as strange and seemingly random as the coyote. So honestly, sometimes that's enough to get the conversation started if you talk about coyotes in a positive light. And say like, wow, I love coyotes. Did you know that they're actually, important to seed dispersal? They're really important to their environments. And when you bring up coyotes in a positive light and somebody, responds to that negatively and says, oh, I think the best coyote is better left dead or something like that. That's something that I hear often. Then just ask people, why do you think that? And just listen. I think this is like part of the issue here is people don't want to listen. People just want, and this is something that I'm working on too, very much so. When you talk about these divisive things, you want to be the one leading the conversation, right? You want to say like, I can't go to somebody and say, oh, well, coyotes don't actually cause that much damage because this, and this, and this. But if I'm talking to someone, a livestock owner who has just lost, a huge chunk of their annual income, that is not an empathetic thing for me to say. That's not an empathetic way for me to enter that conversation. So I need to be able to be open to people and listen to when they say like, I don't like coyotes, and here's why. That's a recent conversation that I just had. That person, the thing that I just said, the best coyote is a dead one. That's what somebody said to me. And I asked them about their experiences with coyotes. He told me about how coyotes had taken his pets before. And he's actually a hunter and he hunts coyotes too. But I talked to him and I had an empathetic, a real conversation. I didn't try to talk at him. I told him why I was interested and I listened to his experience. And because of my enthusiasm and my care for this species, that turned that conversation around. And he said to me that he would be willing to take me to the hunting spots where he goes and he would like to give me a pelt. Empathy and kindness are crucial to having these conversations. So that's just on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I would just say, you know, to have these conversations, maybe open it up in a sense that, you know, well, it really depends on which you know, the context that you're in. Like I've talked to people about how coyotes are actually really important to the way that we care for our pets, not just because, you know, they can potentially prey on them or when they're left unsupervised, but just small things like mosquitoes. Like, do you have plants in your yard that hold water, plant pots? Those mosquitoes actually like to hang out in those. They like to breed there. And there's a particular mosquitoes, Aedes cearensis, I believe it is, that carries dog heartworm. That's out on the west. And if you know, if you're in an area where coyotes are prevalent, urban coyotes are prevalent, and you have this Aedes cearensis mosquito flying around, you know, your neighborhood, then that is a potential risk to your dog. So you need to be mindful of how, you know, we care for these species, how we set up habitats for these species. Are we encroaching on their land? Can that present risks to us? Can that present risks to them? So I think I say that to say, you know, find this common ground. Is there a point that you can connect the coyote, the wolf, to this person's personal life, something that they personally care about? And when you do that, when you open up that door, be empathetic, be willing to listen. Don't just put up your wall and say, oh, you don't like coyotes, then, you know, back off. I don't want to talk to you. Or coyotes are actually really good for the environment. You're just wrong. Don't do that. When you have these conversations, be empathetic and just listen, be kind, and show your enthusiasm for this species, because I promise you, it's really infectious. And I think those are some of the best ways to have conversations. I hope that made sense. I kind of ramble.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's good advice too. So a lot of people just want to be able to track you. So, and again, the comments have just been overwhelmingly positive. So really great job on this, you know, really important topic. And so one thing, if you just want to let people know where they can find you, like on social, or if you have a website or what have you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Actually, let me see if I can. So I, again, as a science communicator reporter, I also work as a web content writer. And this right here is my website. And so like that, I actually list in my About tab under written content. I list a lot of my favorite articles that I've written on that page. And so you can kind of like follow me there and look at like all the different things that I'm writing and maybe the stuff that I'm researching at the time. I love kind of adding on to that, especially stuff that's within this niche that I just talked about. Let's see, I'm also on Twitter. You can follow me at Hi SciComm, and I'm going to put that in there. I'm on LinkedIn. And yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have.
Perfect.
Fine,
Well, what we can do, and again, just a reminder to people that we're going to put this, it'll be on the Wolf Conservation Center website and also our YouTube channel. And we'll make sure on our website and in the description of the channel, we'll put your website. And if you'd like, we can put your Twitter as well. Yeah, I just don't know what to say. This has been really, really such a great presentation. So any last things you want to share with everyone before we wrap up?
Well, again, I just really want to thank you so much. This has been an enormous honor to talk with you all on this topic. I commend you. This is a very hard discussion. I commend you for your braveness and coming to engage in this conversation. I commend you for your compassion and coming to join in this conversation. I know I'm probably going to open up another can of worms when I say this, but I'm very passionate about it. And I think that it is very important. Please, when you talk about hunting, open your mind. Not everything is poaching. Not everything is trophy hunting. Hunting is a part of life for many peoples around the world. And if you are going to be a part of this conversation, if you just watch this presentation and that is what gets you out of this conversation, then I would really invite you to do some self-reflection. That's all I want to leave that with.
Very good. Well, thank you, Sunny, so much. And again, keep an eye out. We will have this presentation posted. And if you want to learn more about Sunny, just visit the Wolf Conservation Center website in a day or two. Or if you want to learn about the Wolf Conservation Center, you can visit our website as well. And that is just www.nywolf.org. And again, Sunny, thank you so much for your time and this excellent presentation tonight. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope you agree that this was really, really an amazing webinar. So thank you very much, Sunny.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.